Euh, Merci beaucoup. C'est un plaisir de pouvoir vous parler d'un peu de la recherche que nous faisons dans mon labo, ici à l'Université de Californie, San Diego. Je m'appelle Ben Bergen, je suis linguiste et I don't actually know how to say cognitive scientist, scientifique cognitive. Uh,
There's always workarounds. Je fais
yeah,
les
you have to.
sciences cognitives.
La plupart de ma recherche euh, euh, est sur le sujet du sens, comment on interprète le langage, les processus cognitifs et computationnels euh, euh, qui le soutiennent. Et aujourd'hui, je vais parler d'un sujet que je n'ai pas, j'ai jamais assemblé. Euh, euh, donc, ça va être un peu, c'est nouveau pour moi. Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to embarrass myself a little bit in French. So before I begin, I want to thank the people who did the really hard part. I have the pleasure of working with some fantastic colleagues, students, including Cameron Jones, who I believe is actually here today, who spearheaded most of the research that I'm going to be talking about today. James Mikhailov, Tyler Chang are also students of mine. Sean Trott, who was integral in parts of this research, was a student of mine, is now a colleague of mine, and Shauna Colson was never a student of mine, but she's a fantastic colleague. And I'll note their contributions as we go. So the computational turn in cognitive science of the, let's call it the 40s or 50s, gave us symbolic representations as the main functional units of cognition. But it's been long argued that the mere manipulation of abstract representations is insufficient for meaning or for understanding or for mindedness. And a large part of the evidence for this comes from thought experiments that you will be well familiar with, like the Chinese room argument or the Chinese dictionary go-round from Stevens' 1990 paper. These thought experiments argue that in order to be intrinsically meaningful, mental representations have to be grounded bottom-up in representations that are iconic to sensory or motor or affective representation, some kinds of grounded representations. And there are a number of approaches that have taken this very seriously, that have built up representational frameworks for how you might go about grounding mental representations in iconic grounded representations. These are approaches that go by names like grounded cognition or perceptual symbol systems or embodied cognition, simulation theory. Some have gone farther and collected evidence, like neural evidence, that parts of the brain that are responsible for perception or motor control or affect are also engaged during higher order tasks like reasoning, memory, and language understanding. And on all these views, human cognition is and must be grounded, because otherwise it's not, the mental computations are not intrinsically meaningful. There's also behavioral evidence that seems to point to a need for grounding. And here I want to give just one example of a kind of classic demonstration. This is from Glenberg and Robertson's 2000 paper. They look at affordances. And affordances, object affordances, as you surely know, are actions or uses for things, objects, that people notice as part of how they experience them. And affordances seem like a very good example of something that grounding would be necessary for, because you know how to interact with objects because you have interacted with them. Glenberg and Robertson showed that people have strong and reliable intuitions about object affordances. So if you give someone a bit of a passage, like Joan was camping but realized she forgot a pillow, so she grabbed a sweater and filled it with, people will generally agree that clothes is a very good word to fill in this spot. But they'll also agree that leaves is pretty good, if not quite as good, and they'll generally agree that water is terrible. And this seems like the kind of inference that you could make if you had grounded experiences with the relevant objects and their affordances. And indeed, Grounding seems important, at least it did in 2000, because at that time, the computational models that they tested on this same task, which were LSA and HAL, produced no such preference. They didn't think that water was worse than leaves. And so that seems to imply that the meaning that humans access involves grounded knowledge about the affordances of objects in order for comprehension to happen. And yet, unless you've been living under a rock for the last 5 years, which seems like a pretty adaptive way to have spent these particular last 5 years, you've seen a string of remarkable achievements by contemporary large language models, such as these. So when it was released in November, GPT-4 achieved better than 90% of humans who took the bar exam. It scored better than 96% of people who took the GRE verbal exam, and it even qualified as a sommelier. LLMs also do quite well on some cognitive psychological tasks. They demonstrate performance that purportedly meets or exceeds the average human participant in reasoning, in theory of mind, and even in using large language models themselves, prompting them more effectively than humans do. So these successes are surprising from a grounded cognition perspective because LLMs are effectively ungrounded. There are currently two major architectures of LLM that are used in most applications. Autoregressive models like the GPTs that you may be familiar with, ChatGPT and others, take tokens as input. Tokens are words or parts of words, and output a probability distribution over the tokens that are likely to come next. So they just predict, in this case, left to right, but they could also do it right to left. Left to right is more relevant for us. Autoencoders or masked models are, what they do is they arbitrarily mask one token at a time within a string, and they predict that the probability of that token given all of the tokens surrounding it on either side. But both of them just take tokens as input to learning and to processing, and they just produce probabilities over those tokens as output, both during training and during processing. There's no innate knowledge built in, there's no body, there's no social or physical interactions, there's just statistics about what words occur where around which other words. So despite a lack of grounding, LLMs can do impressive, intelligent seeming things. The critical question for grounded theories of cognition is how they do on tasks that seem to require grounding. Because if they do quite well, then that starts to undercut the grounding hypothesis. Even if you believe in grounding in principle, in practice, if you can explain human behavior on these cognitive tasks using an ungrounded model, that's prima facie evidence that you may not need grounding after all. So, for instance, how do these models do on the affordances task from Glenberg and Robertson? Well, a lot has changed in the last 23 years. If you give GPT-3 the beginning of a passage, the same one that we saw before, Joan was camping but realized she forgot a pillow, so she grabbed a sweater and filled it with, the first word it fills in actually is leaves, not clothes. And if you let it keep talking, because that's of course all these things do, they're these generative language models, they just produce more words. If you let it keep talking, it explains that by using the sweater and leaves, Joan was able to make a makeshift pillow. This allowed her to have a comfortable night of sleep while camping. Now, this is just a behavioral measure, and we can continue to believe that these are just machines that produce probability distributions over tokens, but this certainly isn't evidence that it doesn't understand the affordance. And so this is quite surprising, and it leads us to ask exactly how to quantify exactly how much of the human behavior in response to tasks like this these large language models are able to accomplish. If they can perform cognitive tasks, and if those tasks are diagnostic of cognitive functions that we think require grounding, then LLMs that capture human behavior act as an existence proof of a cognitive agent that doesn't need grounding to effectively reason using affordances, or as we'll see later, have theory of mind and a variety of other things. And that, of course, entails, as long as certain assumptions about the models and the task are met, that the cognition of humans who achieve these tasks demonstrably might also not be grounded. It is possible that it is not grounded. So that's the and the key bit, of course, is that GPT-3, again, doesn't have any grounded or embodied experience. And so is it even plausible that humans could be, before we even get into how the language models perform, is it even plausible that humans could be using distributional information about how words occur in the world in order to achieve cognitive tasks? Well, in fact, how word co-occurrence statistics, how words co-occur has been proposed for a long time to be a viable pathway to meaning, understanding, and other aspects of cognition, alongside or sometimes instead of innate biases or grounding. So we know, for example, that distributional statistics play a key role in learning in language. So early on in the first year, children are starting to learn phonotactics. That's what sequences of sounds follow what others. And they start to learn word boundaries. And they do this on the basis of distributional statistics about what sounds co-occur with what others. And of course, distributional learning using statistics is also demonstrably used by humans in perception and motor control and lots of other places. And so within the question of meaning and understanding, the basic logic for the distributional hypothesis is that words pattern in ways that reflect relations in the world. So, you know, when you talk about legs, the word leg is likely to co-occur with certain other words, including things that have legs like dogs and cats and lions, but maybe not with things that don't have legs like lights and bark and car. And the word walk is likely to co-occur with words that describe things that walk. And so not because the words have intrinsic meaning to a statistical learner, but just merely because of the co-occurrence statistics, it might be possible that a large enough training set that covers enough of the human experience that with such a training set, you might be able to extract semantic relations from which words co-occur with which other words, you know, like leg co-occurs with cat. And you might be able to extract similarities, like from which words occur in similar contexts, both dog and cat co-occur with leg, such that the relations that you learn, the semantics relations and the semantic similarities that you learn are indistinguishable from those that are produced by a grounded system. And you may be able to extract from a sort of a multi-dimensional representation of the relationships among these words, you might be able to extract meaningful relationships among those words. So the distributional hypothesis is a somewhat viable account of how part of how human cognition might develop. Okay, so a statistical learning account might work. Large language models are kind of the apotheosis, at least for now, of a statistical language learner. They're effectively a fully realized incarnation of a Chinese room, right? And so the question is whether they explain away the things that humans do that to date appeared to be best explained by grounding. And today I'm going to talk about research from my lab that takes a tack on this from sort of three different phenomena. We'll look at affordances a little bit more, what we've already started on. We'll talk about disambiguation in language and talk about theory of mind. So before I get into the actual content, I want to frame out the approach for you here, because this is something that's relatively unique. Haven't seen this in the literature before, but it's something we've been doing and starting to construct as a general approach in the lab. And so I'm very curious to hear your feedback on it. So we take a task that probes a human behavior that is of theoretical interest. In this case, we care about grounding. And it has to be in principle explainable by statistical learning of language. And we run the task on suitable large language models. I'll say more in a second about what makes a large language model suitable. We also run it on humans, and we measure the human behavior. And then we try to measure how much variance in the human behavior on the task is explained by the model. So we partial out whatever can be explained by statistics, and what remains is what cannot be explained by the statistics. So if there remains variance in the human behavior to be explained, then the model, and thus this proxy for statistical language learning, is not sufficient to explain the human behavior. Grounding lives to fight another day. However, if the large language model explains all the relevant variance in human behavior between, say, two relevant conditions, and if the task is diagnostic of the capacity that we think it is, then it follows that statistical language learning is sufficient to explain the human capacity. Now, that doesn't mean that it does explain the human capacity, but it means that it is sufficient to. It could. Note that this is different from just directly comparing performance metrics. So it's not just saying humans score 75% on this task, the model performs 75%. That is an interesting and important metric. But what we're trying to do is actually explain the variance in the human behavior. So the model and the human could both hit 75%, but where they do it in different ways. That doesn't actually count as explaining away the human behavior. So we want to do, we're hoping for something a little bit, it's a stricter criterion. So let me talk about this point two. What's a suitable large language model? So if you want a distributional baseline or a statistical baseline, you need a model that's big enough and powerful enough to approximate a human behavior. And until relatively recently, this was not possible for most human behaviors. There are scaling effects where models get more powerful in lots of tasks as they get bigger and as their data sets, their training data gets larger. And so it's only in the last maybe 5 years that we've really reliably been able to use large language models to approximate behaviors that are interesting from the perspective of meaning and understanding and so on. At the same time, the model has to be small enough to be a realistic proxy for human learning. So the human brain has about 80 or 90 billion neurons and about 100 trillion synapses among those neurons. These are the sort of units of learning that synapses are. And large language models also have units of learning. They're called parameters. It's basically, they are both the weights on connections between nodes and also other values in the computation. But large language models, at least the ones that are big enough to be able to approximate human behavior, all have more parameters than humans have neurons, but fewer parameters than humans have synapses. So GPT-3, the GPT-3s that we'll be talking about range in the couple hundred billion parameter range, and GPT-4, which came out about 10 months ago, has approximately 1.7 trillion parameters, although they haven't actually released how big it is, something like that. So these are certainly much smaller than the number of synapses that humans have. So for a particular kind of inference, if we find that the GPTs fully explain away human behavior, then size is not a problem, because we've already demonstrated that, because we've demonstrated equivalence in behavior despite the models being underpowered compared to human brains. On the other hand, this is an inference problem if we have the opposite finding. So if we find that the models can't explain away human behavior, then it's a concern. Maybe they're just not powerful enough. Maybe humans are better statistical learners, if that makes sense. 3, the model has to be unlikely to have been exposed to the specific task stimuli. So there are lots of cases of contamination in these models. If you scrape all of Wikipedia, which most of these models have, then there's lots of specific information about particular tasks that will already be in the system, and that may include certain task stimuli. So we want to be a little bit careful about that. Oftentimes that involves creating novel stimuli for testing. 4, the model has to be architecturally suited to the human task. So remember those 2 language model architectures that I mentioned earlier. The autoregressive models are the ones that predict left to right. That's a better architecture for approximating online language comprehension, which itself is usually left to right. Other model architectures may be appropriate for other tasks, but we'll be using autoregressive language-only models. Oh, language-only too, right? So many of these models are now also trained, have a visual component to them. If you really want to know whether statistical learning over words themselves can lead to the behavior in question, then obviously you want a language-only model, not one that's integrated with computer vision. You need a model 5 that's trained on a reasonable size of training data. Okay, so this is this is like point two. This is kind of a point that we can't budge much on. So humans are exposed to an estimated something like 100 million words by the time they reach adulthood. GPT-3 is trained on about 300 billion tokens. GPT-4 on probably more than 1 trillion, although once again we don't know, because these are proprietary objects that are owned by private companies. So obviously this means that there's a lot more training data that the large language models are exposed to than humans. So if the models if they're able to achieve parity with humans, if they're able to explain away human variance in human behavior, then this could be a serious inferential concern, because if this is an existence proof, the argument here could go, oh well, but yes, of course a human could learn this if they were exposed to many orders of magnitude more data. It's not a problem if we don't achieve if we don't explain away all of the human behavior with the models. And then finally, they should be trained with no humans in the loop. Lots of these language models, like ChatGPT, for example, and GPT-4, are trained first just on statistical language learning and then other things. And the most concerning other thing is reinforcement learning from human feedback, where the outputs from these models are passed to users who then give thumbs up, thumbs down. You may have been asked to do this if you use ChatGPT, or you may have been asked to do this if you were an underpaid worker in a developing country that OpenAI was underpaying for the service. That you would then be asked to give human feedback. And that leads to a lot of the sort of tailoring for human preferences that happens in these models. We'd probably not like to include that, because that is not what we're testing. We're testing for a statistical baseline, not a statistical baseline that's then reinforced by human feedback. Okay, so picking the models turns out to be a really big deal. Again, this is the approach. We're taking a task that probes the human behavior, run the task on the models, run the task on the human, ask if the model explains some or all of the variance in the human behavior on the task. Okay, thank you for sitting through that preamble. Now we're going to get into the actual meat of the thing. So let's start by talking about affordances. So you don't need an introduction to affordances. This is work that was spearheaded by Cameron Jones, who I think may actually even be here, who is nearing the end of his PhD program. You should hire him. And also by all these other fine folks. So we used scenarios from Glenberg and Robertson. They look like this. After wading barefoot in the lake, Eric needed something to get dry. He used his blank to dry his feet. And there are three possibilities. You could have a response that's the sort of the best completion, towel. People really like that one. He used his shirt to dry his feet. People also really like that one, even though it's a less likely completion. And then there's a non-afforded response, right? Glasses cannot really be used to dry feet except in sort of elaborate scenarios where you're using them as a magnifying glass or something like that, that unlikely to be afforded by glasses. So we presented these two large language models, several of them, including GPT-3 and BERT and Roberta, and we took the probability of each token. So remember, again, a token is a word or a word part. So we took the probability of each of these tokens in that variable slot, in that gap there. And we computed the surprisal. So surprisal is just the negative log probability of the token. So it's it's a log transformed probability. And so we did the same task with 123 human participants at UCSD. And here's what the humans did. These were their sensibility judgments. So we just asked them, how sensible is each of these words separately in this gap, in this context? And not surprisingly, humans in 2023 respond very similarly to humans in 2000 with the original Glenberg and Robertson study, which is that they think towel is a really good thing to dry your feet with, and shirt is an okay, but still very good thing to dry your feet with, and glasses are a pretty bad thing to dry your feet with, and there are differences among all of these conditions. So how about the language models? Well, GPT-3 did the best of them, and here's what it showed. So it actually didn't see a difference between shirt and towel, which is fine. That doesn't address our main issue, which is, do you know what things are afforded versus not afforded? And it did, in fact, show sensitivity to the difference between glasses and shirt. So unlike the models from 2000, GPT-3, and maybe this is not surprising by the evidence that we saw the sort of anecdotal evidence earlier. Across all of these passages, it shows a very small but significant difference between afforded and non-afforded objects in this condition. But what we do next is focus on the human behavior itself. So this, and ask how much of this is explained by this. And so when we do that, we see that the three models that we had were all pretty good at explaining some variance above and beyond a baseline that did not include their surprisal as a predictor. But condition does a far better job. So which condition the human was in. So the human behavior is best explained by the condition that the human was in, and it does so far better than any of the surprisals. And when you use the surprisals in a model, in a regression, and then add condition onto that, do a likelihood ratio test, you find that condition still explains a lot of the variance above and beyond GPT-3 surprisal, BERT surprisal, or Roberta surprisal. So there is still lots and lots of human behavior that cannot be explained by any of these language models. And maybe that's not surprising when you look here and you see that this difference is much bigger than this difference here. Okay. We can apply the same logic to disambiguation. Now, of course, human language is pervasively ambiguous. It's been proposed that humans use grounded world knowledge to ferret out intended meanings in cases like this. So this is sort of a task that's inspired by the Winograd Schema Challenge. If you give someone a sentence like, when the rock fell on the vase, it broke, it's not obvious necessarily, unless you're a linguist or a psycholinguist or something, but it is actually ambiguous because it could refer to either the rock or the vase, or in fact, it could refer to some third thing not mentioned here. But for our purposes, let's just say the rock, which is the first noun, or the vase, which is the second noun. And almost universally, people will decide very quickly that it refers to the vase. Now, you might say, well, that's because it makes sense. And that's exactly the argument that people who believe that grounded world knowledge is important here. Yes, you know that vases are more likely to break than rocks are. And you can sort of prove that to yourself by switching around the objects. When the snow globe fell on the steel table, it broke. Now, if you were given this out of context, you'd probably be more likely to say that it refers to snow globe than to steel table, just because of the physical properties of the objects in question that you know about. And there are cases that are even more complicated than this. So if you're an aficionado of baseball, this might be very clear to you. But if you're not, you might find that the following sentence is a little bit tricky to interpret. When the baseball collided with the bat, it broke. So if you've watched lots of baseball or played baseball, you know that bats are the most likely thing to break in this scenario. But if you're not, you might actually wonder which of these it is, and you might have to use other contextual cues. Like maybe you'll use the order that the words were presented in. So maybe you prefer that the first noun be the thing that it refers to, or other things. Okay. Nevertheless, at the same time, statistical models do quite well on tasks like this. So I mentioned that this is based on a thing called the Winograd Schema Challenge, which asks for similar stuff. Well, this challenge has ostensibly been solved by large language models in the last 5 years. So does evidence that humans use grounded world knowledge persist even after partialing out the predictions of large language models? That's the question here. So Cameron Jones, once again, you should hire him, was the lead on this. We created 30 new scenarios like the ones that you see here, where we switch the order just to make sure that order is not driving the effect. And we conducted a norming to figure out what's the effect of world knowledge on people's judgments about this task. So we asked people explicitly in a separate norming task, if a vase fell on a rock, which would be more likely to break? Or if a rock fell on a vase, which would be more likely to break? And we use those as the predictors for people's judgments in this task. We presented these scenarios to GPT-3, and what we calculated was the log probability of broke given the prior context. When the rock fell on the vase, the rock broke. So that measures how likely you think it is that broke applies to rock here. Or when the rock fell on the vase broke. That tests how likely you think it is that broke applies to vase. We also ran the task with human participants, again, from the UCSD subject pool. And here's what you see in terms of results. I want you to first look at the lavender or pink dots and line and error bars here. So this is what GPT-3 does. So these results are showing on the x-axis the probability of the second noun being the one that's referred to. So for example, in a scenario like this, when the vase fell on the rock, it broke, it refers to rock. So this is the probability, the predictor's probability of that, and then this is the human's probability of that. So basically, if the predictor, in this case GPT-3, and humans are totally aligned, then you should see a perfect positive correlation between these two. The more probable the GPT says it is, the more probable humans should say that it is. And what you do see with these pink dots is a positive correlation. It's not a perfect one, but GPT-3 is explaining variance in human behavior. But if you use that now, that pink stuff, as a predictor, and add on the world knowledge bias from the norming task, how much does world knowledge push around these behaviors in humans? What you find is the residual correlation shown here in blue. That is to say that even partialing out, even controlling for what's in pink, the predictions of GPT-3, still you get a positive, significant correlation between people's knowledge about the world and their judgments of which noun is most likely referred to by this ambiguous word, it. And the likelihood ratio test between the model that includes versus doesn't include world knowledge bias is, again, very highly significant. As people who work on language, we're always interested, of course, additionally in real-time processing of language. So this is people's static judgments offline, which is more likely. We also performed an online version of the task where people performed self-paced reading. They pressed a button to see a next bit of a passage, and then a next bit, and a next bit, and a next bit. And we calculated probabilities from GPT-3 also on those same bits of language. And without going too much into the details, what we found was that GPT-3 showed very little difference between the rock and the vase in these passages, but humans showed very large differences between the rock and the vase, for example, and other similar stimuli. Differences that were not explained by the predictions of GPT-3. And once again, the likelihood ratio test between the model that includes the human predictors, world knowledge, and the one that doesn't is highly significant. So in offline and online language comprehension tasks, people seem to be disambiguating using something beyond the statistics that GPT-3 is able to use and generate probabilities from. The last set of studies that I want to talk about address theory of mind. Now, obviously, I need to start with a big caveat. Theory of mind may not be one unitary, uniform thing. There may be lots of things that people group together as theory of mind. So I want to focus first here specifically on false beliefs. So most neurotypical human adults are able to represent and reason about the mental states of others, including how those beliefs may differ from our own. What's key is that early social interactions appear to be critical to its development. Wild children and kids who have restricted social interactions early on seem to have limited abilities in false belief tasks and theory of mind tasks in general. Right. So it could be that grounded experiences are important to its development. It's also been theorized that the relevant experiences might actually be language exposure itself, because we're exposed to verbs like know and believe, and maybe that triggers us to think about the possibility that there are other knowledge and beliefs than those that we hold ourselves. So there's a good grounded story here, but there's also a good distributional story here, a good statistical story here. And the particular task that I'm going to focus on here is a false belief task. If you're not familiar with it, it's probably best known and most familiar through the Sally-Ann task. Sally-Ann task is used in diagnoses of autism spectrum disorder, among a variety of other things. And it goes kind of like this. This is Sally. Sally has a basket. This is Anne. Anne has a box. Sally has a marble. She puts the marble into her basket. Sally goes out for a walk. Anne takes the marble out of the basket and puts it in the box. Now Sally comes back. She wants to play with her marble. And the question to you, the participant, is where will Sally look for her marble? Now, if you are able to represent that Sally has beliefs that are different from yours, and you are currently representing what she knows and what information she's likely to have collected in this scenario, then you should know that she doesn't know that the marble has been transferred to the box because she was out of the room, so she should look in the basket. But if you're not able to do that, then you should say that she will look in the box, just like you would, because of where you know the marble is. So we built up a linguistic version of the false belief task. The co-first authors on this were Sean Trott, my colleague. You can hire him if you want to, but I prefer not because I really like him as a colleague. And Cameron Jones, once again, eminently hireable. This linguistic false belief task is basically the language version of this. So Sean, in the false belief task, it would be something like Sean is reading a book. When he's done, he puts the book in the box. Then Anna comes into the room. Sean leaves to get something to eat in the kitchen. While he's away, Anna moves the book from the box to the basket. Sean comes back into the room and wants to read more of the book. Sean thinks the book is in the, and this is just the Sally Ann task again. If you are correctly representing that Sean's belief is false, then you should say that he is likely to look in the original location, the starting location in the box, because that's where it was when Sean left. But if you are not able to, then you should say that it's in the ending location. And then we need a baseline to control for just bias. People might have a preference for the starting or the end location, and so we use a true belief passage here too, where the only difference is that Sean is in the room while the book is moved from the box to the basket, so he knows where it is. So he has a true belief. So in the true belief case, we should always observe people saying, if they're doing this correctly, that that Sean will look in the end location, because everyone, including Sean, knows that that's where it is. Okay, so we created 12 new passage templates for this task, again, so that we knew that the models had not been exposed to them, and we varied the order of mention, the explicitness of the knowledge cues, a bunch of other things to produce 16 versions of each of these 12 new passages. We computed from GPT-3 for each of them. Once again, the log probability of the start location versus the log probability of the end location in this slot here. So Sean thinks the book is in the, what's the probability of box? What's the probability of basket? We subtract basket from box. Higher value, therefore, means that the model thinks that the start is the more likely place for the object to be. We also ran this on 613 human participants after exclusions from Mechanical Turk. We had to run so many because each of them read only one version of one passage and filled in the final blank on them. We wanted to make sure that they didn't learn over repeated exposure to similar kinds of stimuli. We wanted a sort of a zero-shot baseline. Okay, so results. GPT-3 is sensitive to belief state. So I mentioned that we had both implicit and explicit cues. We wanted to know, whether there are differences in exactly how you prompt for what Sean knows. So this is just a density plot that shows GPT-3's log odds, so start versus end. Remember, higher values means that it thinks that the start is more likely. It's more likely to, I shouldn't say thinks. It is, I don't want to anthropomorphize too much. It is projecting as more probable the starting location than the end location. And so here, in this task, what it's saying is that for the true belief case, where everyone should agree that it is in the end location, it's more likely to say end. So the blue lumps are further to the left than the salmon lumps. In the false belief task, those judgments are shifted more towards the starting location. So it is more likely to predict the starting location, regardless of the specific cue, whether it's Sean goes to get the thing from the box or from the blank, or Sean thinks the thing is in the blank. In the false belief condition, it is more likely to say that to go with Sean's presumed beliefs. So it is, in fact, sensitive to belief state. It is, I don't know if it's passing the false belief task, but it is responding as though it were sensitive to false beliefs as opposed to true beliefs. So this is aggregated over the various conditions that GPT-3 was exposed to, and now just shows the probability of the that it responds with start being the location where the object is. And this is just demonstrating the same thing that we saw. GPT-3 is sensitive to false belief. In the false belief condition, that's the salmon one, the start is more likely than it is in the true belief condition. However, humans, down on the bottom here, show a much stronger effect. So in the true belief condition, they're actually relatively similar to the models. But in the false belief condition, there's just a whole bunch of correct, if you are attributing beliefs appropriately to Sean. There is a much more prediction by humans that Sean will look in the wrong location. That's what this huge peak here says. And once again, if you run the likelihood ratio test that compares a regression with and without the condition for humans, then you find that you get a large significant effect. And as I said earlier, theory of mind is a heterogeneous construct. We've run this on now, again, in work spearheaded by Cameron. Hire him. We've done a bunch of different false belief theory of mind tasks. So this is the false belief that you've just seen. We did recursive mind reading, which is how many degrees of embedding can people recall, extract, and understand. So John thinks that Sheila believes that Joan wants, etc. How many degrees of embedding? Many more than you might predict, actually, as it turns out. We've done the short stories task, which is used to assess mentalizing. People read a short story by Hemingway, the end of something, and then are asked to answer some questions that really ask to dig deeply into intentions and emotions and stuff. This is then hand-coded by humans for how much the participants are responding with answers that dig into mental states of others. We've used the strange stories task, so that's also used for autism spectrum disorder diagnosis. These are little vignettes that probe sort of social reasoning, like white lies and that kind of thing. Indirect request task, which is kind of like false belief, except adds on an inference about why someone would say something. So if you say, man, it's really cold in here, you could be making a request for someone to change that, to close a window or give you a blanket or something, but that might differ depending on what you know about what that other person knows and can do. And finally, we've done it on scalar implicature, which is basically if I say that two of the three pizzas are burned, you infer that the third pizza is not burned, unless you also know that I don't know about the third pizza. Okay, so that's kind of scalar implicature, and we did that. And so what you see here is just a rough depiction of how people do in all of these tasks. That's these violin plots here with the means and 95% confidence intervals. In false belief, recursive mind reading, short stories, strange stories, and so on. And then the red diamonds are GPT-3's mean. This is the best performing GPT-3 before reinforcement learning from human feedback. And what you see is kind of interesting. So in general, the language models appear to be relatively sensitive to certain kinds of beliefs. They're very bad at these pragmatic tasks where you have to infer why someone would have said something. But they are pretty sensitive to beliefs in general. They seem decent at mentalizing and so on. They seem to be roughly, at least in terms of their accuracy, they're at parity with humans in certain cases, but not a variety of others. And overall, they seem to generally do worse, but not in all cases. And critically, for all of these studies in which we could measure the remaining human effect when partialing out the language model performance, there is still a significant effect of the human behavior that's unexplainable using the language models. Okay, so the takeaway from this is that, large language models approximate human behavioral effects in basically all of the tasks that we tried that have previously been used as evidence of grounded cognitive capacities. Yet, at present, large language models still fail to explain away human behavior in any of the tasks. So, grounding or another explanation aside from statistical language prediction is still required for all of these human behaviors. Okay, now comes the objections part. There's more than one objection. Don't worry. I'm trying to get ahead of the game here because I know you're going to have lots of objections. Okay, so first objection: many effects scale with model size. So this lack of explaining away will likely change soon if it hasn't already, and that's a likely case. So we've actually looked at how these effects scale on. So this is for those. This is for a bunch of those theory of mind tasks. So some of them, these are all showing the performance of the large language models on the y-axis, and on the x-axis you see the size of the models. We have 4 different models that have different numbers of parameters, and as they get bigger, for some tasks they get better, for some tasks they get a lot better, and for some they don't seem to get better at all. There's actually inverse scaling maybe here going on. They seem to be a chance. And so it's certainly possible that there will be scaling effects for some of these tasks. On the other hand, as we said earlier, we want to ensure that the language models we're using as proxies are not so big as to be bigger than could possibly approximate the learning capacity of a human exposed to these statistics. And so there's a point at which scaling becomes irrelevant because the model now becomes a model of a superhuman. Okay. Here's some more objections. Maybe the models are already too big. Maybe they have more parameters than humans have neurons. Again, I would argue that it's probably synapses and not neurons, and we're actually not in the too big stage here yet. You might object that the models might be too small. They have fewer parameters than humans have synapses, and that's actually viable. So I think that that's a reasonable concern. On the other hand, the size of the model has to be balanced with the next point, which is the size of the data set that they're trained on. So although the models are too small, the data are actually too big. So if we make the data too big and the model the right size, we may actually be in the state where we're overestimating the human capacity because everything is better for the model than it is for the human. So at present, the best I can do is to say we've underestimated the model size, we've overestimated the data size, and maybe we're roughly in the right ballpark, hopefully. You might say that the training data that these language models are exposed to is not human-directed enough. That is, it doesn't look enough like what humans are exposed to in statistical language learning, and so humans could still learn through statistics alone if they got the right kind of language input, which they do get. And if a language model got that, then it would learn appropriately as well. I think that's a reasonable concern. There are some people who have been trying to train models using more suitable training data, so stuff that scales like child-directed speech does, and using some child-directed speech too. It doesn't seem like the behaviors of those models are too different, but it's an in-principle objection that I could get behind. You might object that the tasks might not actually diagnose the cognitive capacities that we think they do. So you might say, okay, well, let's say that you achieve parity with humans on a model. Let's say you explain away all the variance using a model. Well, that might not mean that the task that they're performing on is actually assessing whatever we care about: affordances, meaning, understanding, theory of mind. And then you have to move the goalposts. Then you have to say, well, okay, no, what we really need in order to assess this capacity is some higher bar, some higher threshold. I think that might be a good thing for the field to do if it involves sharpening our diagnostic tools and refining exactly what we mean when we talk about cognitive capacities. And finally, you might say that explaining away human effects seems like too high a bar. So for example, maybe you think, well, simply showing sensitivity should be enough, right? That's a proof of concept that you could, in principle, learn learn to achieve human-like performance on the tasks using language statistics. You just need to do something with those statistics afterwards that's different from the statistical language learning. I think that's an interesting rejoinder. I'm not sure it's true though. So you can find light-sensitive patches on sea creatures that are sensitive to light, but that doesn't mean that a light-sensitive patch by itself is sufficient to explain human vision. So I think that what we really want is a demonstration that the system that is only using statistics can perform in a human-like way in order for us to really be convinced that this is a viable hypothesis for the behavior that explains away the need for grounding. From the highest level, I just want to make a case or actually ask you as a question about the viability of this approach of using large language models as statistical baselines. To me, this seems like a promising avenue. We use large language models to determine to what extent statistical language learning can explain human cognitive capacities. In this case, they're theorized to be grounded, but you could do this for innate capacities. You could do it for capacities that are hypothesized to be generated in other ways, and so through social interaction and that sort of thing. And so, so I think that quite aside from their intrinsic interest as tools and as objects of inquiry of themselves, large language models can actually serve as a really neat statistical baseline that allow us to hone our inferences about how humans are able to do the things that they're able to do. I would like to end by thanking you. Thanks so much for your attention, and I look forward to the conversation.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, this is the way we'll handle it is there might be some questions. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Somebody, okay. There'll be some questions that are local, and there's some things that'll be from the web. If you're asking from the web, please use the hand raising feature to identify yourself as wanting to ask a question. Okay. And while you're finding that button, I'll start. And over here, levez la main si vous voulez poser une question. Over here, okay. So those are the two ways to ask questions. Let me just kick it off first by a question that I'm going to ask every single speaker in this series, both in the autumn and in the winter. What do you mean by grounding?
Great. So this is a great question. I think that I want to be big tent about grounding and accommodate the various different things that people have said. So in some cases, people believe that grounding is means that there are symbols that themselves retain features of perceptual representations or affective or motor representations. So they are iconic in some way, and those are the symbols. Those are the objects of computation internally. In some cases, I think that people believe that there's a transduction process whereby there's a relationship between the perceptual, motor, affective, whatever states, and relatively more abstract symbols that take on totally different properties, but still retain features of those and are connected to them in some way, such that they can be referred to. So, for example, an abstract amodal symbol for an object, like leaves, still retains connections to the perceptual knowledge that you have about leaves, the motor knowledge, the olfactory knowledge that you have about leaves, and that can be consulted as needed in real time through a simulation process. And so I don't want to make a commitment to one or the other of those. What I do think is that this particular line of reasoning addresses both of them, because the large language models have neither of those. They neither have internal representations that themselves are intrinsically iconic because of their ontogeny, nor does it have this capacity for simulation, as far as we can tell. So, I think that whichever one you believe in, this approach can, in this case, vindicate or potentially can obviate either of them.
Okay, thank you. I do have a second question. I'm still waiting for hands to start appearing. I'm willing to interrupt. As a matter of fact, we have one right here. I'll ask my second question later. Say it really loud to see if he can hear it.
Are you hearing me right now?
A little bit, yeah.
Very loud. Go like this.
No.
Okay.
Yeah, I have two separate questions. One, first about the methodology used for the test. So when you did the degree test, the Affordances test, you used some instance of BERT and GPT. But for the rest, you only use GPT itself. Was it because from the original test you saw there was no case in using BERT or Bloom since the result would not be significant, or was it just that you didn't have the time or something like that?
Yeah, great question. So it's two reasons. One, GPT-3 and 4 tend to do better than the other models on almost any task that we put them to. So they serve as kind of a higher bar. And second, BERT and Roberta are these masked models where they're predicting a word from all of the words around it in either direction. And that's not what humans do, right? Humans predict the next word. Usually, unless they're given that specific task, they predict the next word given what preceded it. They don't see the future. These BERT and Roberta do see the future. And so in the affordances task, because the gap was kind of in the middle of a sentence, we thought this is more equivalent to what humans are doing. But in the other tasks, they're just left to right reading. So it makes more sense to use an autoregressive model that's just one word at a time.
Are you there? Could you repeat that, Ben? There was a lag.
Oh, I'm sorry. From where?
Most.
I would say last 10, 15 seconds, something like that.
Okay, rewind. So for most tasks, humans are going word by word, and they're just predicting the next word. And that's exactly like what GPT-3 is doing. So it's a better fit for most tasks, with the exception of the affordances task, which I don't know if you remember, but there was the gap was, I can actually show you, the gap was in the middle. Let's see if I can find it. The gap was, I don't know if you can see that.
That would be great. Yeah.
Yeah, so that made it a good fit for the masked models.
Okay, thanks. The other question that I had is a bit more general to the idea. Since we are trying to see if the statistical model could be used to infer stuff without needing to use cognition, there was a question that's in my brain that I already talked before, which is, since most of the cognition definition that I read in the past talk about the capacity for evaluation and amelioration of the brain, you learn something in long-term memory, you use it to change the result. Since the statistical model with the LLM, if you do the same question, same test with let's say different IP address in a part of the world, you're not going to get anything from short-term memory, since it doesn't have any real long-term. It can't redo the model itself on the fly. This is not missing like a crucial part of what we define as human cognition when we even start the test at the start.
I'm not sure. I'm 100% sure that is the question. Since these models don't have short-term memory, are they
don't have long-term? I meant, sorry.
Since they don't have long-term memory, is what he said.
They don't have long-term memory. I mean, they learn, and so they're able to. I mean, they don't have like episodic memory or anything like that we know of. But I mean, their weights are changed on a permanent basis over the course of pre-training. So I don't know if there's a particular aspect of long-term memory that you think they don't have.
I'm pretty sure one point I'm going to know a sentence, but right now I get the issue. I'm not sure how to phrase it in a way that's understandable for others. Sorry.
Ok. Tu peux le dire en français si tu veux.
Non, je pense qu'en français, j'aurais le même problème.
Ok.
J'ai la question en tête, mais je suis pas capable de savoir
Okay, on passe. I'm still waiting for hands from the audience, and I have questions here as well. But let me, meanwhile, give an answer to that definition of grounding that we got. I don't have a monopoly on this, so this is just what I say. But words are symbols, and they're the main ones we're talking about. ChatGPT is a word bag, so it's a lot of words. The grounding, to have a word grounded, one of the things, on my view, that you have is the capacity to pick out the referent with your sensory motor capacities or with your robotic capacities in the world, and to interact with the referent. It's not just a label and a bunch of other labels. In fact, a label and a bunch of other labels is the symbol grounding problem. So that's just a definitional point. You can agree or not agree. But now my second question, what you gave was, you were comparing human performance and GPT performance on on mind reading and word completion tasks. And you found, I don't know if you were happy about it or sad about it, but you found that GPT still does better. So there's some sort of residual room for grounding in your sense.
Just to be clear, GPT does not explain away the human behavior. So the humans.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's the point, that there's still room for saying that you need humans to be able to do this, and they need grounding in order to be able to do it. That's your reluctant conclusion. But isn't there, and that's interesting, and of course it's probably right, but isn't there a more interesting question with the same kinds of data for the stuff that ChatGPT can do? If it's not going to save you the effort of finding a real model of how it is that we do these things with our brains and with our cognitive capacities. If it simply is a computational and data processing device that does amazing things, we have to all admit that we're surprised by what it can do. How does it do it? And do your experiments cast any light on how it's doing it? Not so much on the fact that you need grounding to do as well as humans, but how does it do as well as it can?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And that's a sister enterprise to this one that focuses on the models themselves and explores their functioning and so on. You know, in a way, it's easier to understand how things work in the models because unlike human brains, you can take them apart and look at all the pieces. And unlike humans, you can ask them to do a nearly infinite number of different things without fatiguing them, without changing them, and so on. And that is a bit of what we do. I have to admit, I'm sort of more interested in humans. I'm more interested in grounding than in how the models work. But yes, that absolutely, and that is the type of thing that one could do.
Okay. Other questions in this room? Yes. Can you come close?
I can come close. So,
and the rest of you, why did you come to this talk if you're not thinking of questions? Think of questions. Go ahead.
all right, I'm not sure can you hear me all right?
Yes.
I'm not sure there's going to be a good answer to this. I'm a little hesitant to ask it, but in the comparisons between the number of synapses in the human brain and say GPT-4 with approximately 1.7 parameters, 1.7 trillion parameters, we don't necessarily need all of the synapses in our brain to do the things that we're asking GPT-4 or whichever model to do. So if you look at examples like what's needed for motor skills or things like that, that aren't necessarily any kind of logical cognitive process.
Hang on a second. Feedback check. Are you understanding this?
Yes. Yeah. I got everything. Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
So is there research maybe related to yours or something you can say about what might be the amount of human synapses that are necessary to do to compare with a model that isn't enjoying embodiment or is basically just a box that got trained statistically and so forth?
Yeah. Love the question. It's a great point. You're right. I don't have the precise number for any given task because, of course, we don't fully understand what brain systems are involved in any particular task down to the level of number of neurons or synapses, but not any of these interesting tasks anyway. But I think that your general point is right, that the total number of human synapses is an overestimate of what we would want to be targeting in terms of model size, just because, yes, obviously, you're probably not using the midbrain much for this. Great point.
Got that? Okay, Steve Hansen, turn on your camera and your mic.
You
Good.
see?
Yep. Go ahead.
Yeah, so actually from New Jersey, where it actually is truly overcast, unlike San Diego, I bet. I have a couple questions. I actually really love what you're doing. However, I do, and I say that just because I'm going to criticize you. So here we go. This seems like some kind of Dust Bowl empiricism, some kind of behaviorism from B.F. Skinner's time. I'm a little concerned that there's a lot of people, and I think Gary Marcus perhaps is the worst offender, that's muddying the waters so bad that we don't really know what's going on. And since, March 20th, 2022, and before Jeff Hinton decided we were about to all be doomed, we have no idea how these work. And I would basically push back on the idea that this is some kind of co-occurrence statistics. This is a transformer, a prediction scheme. I've used these since the 80s for lots of things, and including doing language processing on relatively large archives. The brown corpus, oh my God, it was 1 million running words at the time. Okay, so this, having 1 billion anything in this is pretty amazing. Plus, we also have something that is got these attention weights, which you've sort of left out of the story. And we don't really know what those are doing. And the OpenAI people haven't a clue. No one has a clue what this is doing. So I applaud your attempt at trying to disambiguate some of the kind of intellectual abilities of these LLMs relative to humans. But it seems like we've created two mysteries here, one having to do with the brain, which, as you just pointed out, language-wise, we really don't understand, how many language paths there are and how we're actually doing this and what prefrontal cortex has to do with a lot of this. And so now we have this other thing, which, is almost like finding another species on a planet. We don't know where it came from. We don't know what it's doing. And we don't know how to get at what it's doing. So I have looked inside of these. I've looked inside of GPT-3. And there's around 50 million clusters, around 50 million contexts. So it looks like one of the powers here of these things has to do with context. Now, I'm not going to delve into what context is here, but I do think that's sort of a critical key aspect of why these things work. And the difference between 3 and 4 is probably something like 30 million contexts. So 4 just has more kinds of ways to relate to the world. But how and why? And why is it doing this fluid language processing? Where the heck does that come from? It's got a context-free grammar, I suspect. How did it learn that from positive examples? Chomsky's told us for years that's impossible. And here we are talking to something that learned from positive examples. So you can see I feel like so again, I love your work. However, it feels like you're kind of nibbling around the fringes of what's in here. And if you jumped in the middle of it, it would eat you. So that's my reaction.
Well, thank you. I love that perspective. And I totally agree that to a worrying degree, these are black boxes. And so if the concern is you're trying to explain something using a black box, do you actually learn anything from that? I'm sensitive to that. I think that's a reasonable concern. On the other hand, even if they're doing very smart things, they're building up. So it's clear that they are building very complex computational tools inside these learning systems that we don't fully understand. Nevertheless, the input and the output, I mean, the objective function is just predict the next word. And the only training they've ever gotten was on words. even the, the embeddings, like you start with embeddings, but those embeddings are still just built from word statistics. So I still think that it logically, it makes sense to use these as sort of best case scenarios of what one could do with language statistics. Now, this sort of connects to Stephen's point. So, Stephen, you may not be familiar with my earlier work, but a lot of it is trying to explore embodiment directly through behavioral experimentation, and found lots of interesting embodiment effects, and sort of made an early career off of that. So I wasn't particularly disappointed that the models failed to explain away the grounding effects that we saw here. We went in. Maybe Cameron and I disagree on this, but I think we went in with relatively open to the possible outcomes, hoping that we'd find something interesting, and I think we have. Back to your point, other Stephen. If we take these as best case scenarios, then it might not matter what's inside the black box if the point is what's the best that you can do from language statistics alone. I think both Stephen's points are that we really like to know better what's going on inside. I agree. Those are different tools from the sort of behavioral experimentation I think that we've been doing so far. They're going to involve probing, and they're going to involve sort of causal analyses and stuff like that. And some of those are things that are happening in the lab, but more slowly.
I'm going to ask Cameron what he disagrees with in a second. Hold on, Cameron. But first, I want to ask Dimitri if he's willing. You have without preempting your own talk, you have some ideas about what's going on in the box. Did you disappear, or are you there? Dimitri?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
So do you want to address the question of what's going on inside the box with your vectorial idea?
Right. So I'm not sure it's the same sense of what's happening inside the box as the one Stephen would be perhaps satisfied by. But I do think that seeing LLMs as black boxes is only partially true and maybe highly misleading. We have lots of work in mechanistic interpretability that is trying to shed light on what is actually going on there. And so they aren't really black boxes. They are very complex systems that are very difficult to study. But that does not mean that there are no ways of trying to improve our understanding of them. And lots of these, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that next week as well. Some of the challenges that we find when we confront these very complex systems are somewhat similar to the challenges we find in neuroscience, for example, when we are trying to understand how brains work. Also a very complex system of which we have very little or relatively little understanding. So I'd like to push back on this idea that these are black boxes or things that are mysterious in ways that are beyond anything that we can fathom. It's just that the whole work on mechanistic interpretability is quite recent, so it's still taking its first steps. But for example, people working with Chrysola, for example, have made lots of progress in trying to understanding transformers, for example, talking about the residual stream and looking at what attention heads may be doing, etc., etc. So I do think we are starting to get a much better idea of what is going on in these systems with some idealization, some simplification, but that goes for the brain as well, and for pretty much any complex system in science. So yeah, but I'm going to talk more about this next week, and we can discuss this further.
Benny, any rejoinder, or can we go to Cameron? Oh, and Steve, you'll get.
Can I just, yeah. So yeah, no, I am astounded by how little we understand here. And we had, back in the 80s, the connectionists were basically saying, oh, this will all be emergent. Well, this happened. There was an emergent thing that happened. And it just seems like everyone has just gone asleep. Like, wow, okay, now let's just figure out what it's doing. No, it's not going to be that easy. And even if it looks like dynamical systems, okay, that might be governing, parts of the galaxy or parts of, the brain or anything you want to choose that's complex, we don't understand that either. So I think there's something that happened here that is a phase point, a phase transition, that something happened. And there's lots of people I know trying to figure this out, and and this is why a lot of people start getting scared, because it just seems to accumulate more kinds of abilities that good psychologists like Ben here, good cognitive can address and say, oh, it looks the same. And there's some similar work I've seen done on probability words, showing that there's like a 0.9 linear regression between probability words that humans use and probability words that ChatGPT-4 uses. It's like it somehow extracted information from predicting one word ahead. And there's nothing in my experience that makes sense of this. So sorry, I'm just not that blasé about it. And I'm really upset with people like Gary Marcus, who seem to be on one side and the other side, not, basically he's just trying to get in a spotlight or something, but it's just useless. Sorry.
Okay, Gary. I mean Cameron. Where are we? Munir, you wanna speak now? Go ahead. Turn on your camera.
Let's see.
Go ahead.
Do you hear me?
Yes.
All right. Well, I usually am not active in those seminars, but I really love what the colleague from New Jersey has said so far, and this pushes me to react as well. I'm one of those technical people who kind of think they understand what ChatGPT consists of or what it's doing, although I really don't understand, why it's doing what it's doing. I mean, I know, there are vector matrix multiplications and gradient descent and all kinds of stuff in there, but I really don't quite understand why they're there. I mean, yeah, I do know the basics, which are, okay, we have errors, we're trying to minimize them. We learned from differential calculus that we have to minimize derivatives, which are called gradients when you have multi-dimensional spaces and so on and so forth. And then you have this business of query, key value things. And anyways, the point is this, I also don't understand how this relates to intelligence. I mean, does the brain do gradient descent to understand things? Also, do statistics help us understand what intelligence is? I mean, the idea of predicting the next element in the sequence, given the previous elements, this goes to Markovian modeling, and we already knew that in the 70s. I mean, when I did my PhD thesis on hidden Markov processes, so, and that was in the 70s. So it gives you an idea about how long we've known these things. So what do this new paradigm, if you want, bring to us in terms of understanding what intelligence is? For instance, I think I joined a little late the seminar, so I don't know what the beginning was. But in the end, I kind of understood that there was a comparison between ChatGPT and behavioral experiments that were conducted. And I really don't understand how from those experiments, like from this false belief or true belief experiments, you could infer something relevant with respect to ChatGPT. I mean, ChatGPT is really a mechanical toy that essentially solves a Markov decision process by giving you numbers instead of symbols for the conditional probabilities. That's all it does, okay? You have this basic construct or basic axiom, if you want, of language models, which is, okay, I have a sequence, I want to know what the probability of the next element is given the ones that I have. And if I have enough data, I can solve that. I can know what the number is, what the exact value of that probability is. But having said that, I mean, what's the connection with intelligence? I'm not sure.
Yeah, I mean, so fortunately, I think, Stephen, you said you recorded the session, right? So you could go back and all of the framing is there, right there at the beginning. The question is not actually about computer intelligence. The question is about grounding in human cognition. And so I'd refer back to the beginning there.
Okay, Pierre.
Yes, I think that this is all related to Stefan Chinese directory. In fact, ChatGPT, you could use ChatGPT to read this famous Chinese dictionary. And after that, you would have the impression that it can speak Chinese, because the intelligent part of ChatGPT is a gigantic memory with a perfect indexing capacity. It has, the index is based on millions of bits, and for each character available in the Chinese directory, it knows the interconnection between each character and each other character, and from that it can predict, with some long-term memory, it can predict what is the next word that it has seen the most often in only that directory. So by putting characters together, it will end up making sentences that make sense because these sentences exist in the Chinese directory, and because it can find the interrelation between all these characters. We see ChatGPT working on symbols which are words in English, but there would be no difference for if we applied exactly the same algorithms to symbols in a Chinese directory. Human would not be able to do this. Humans cannot even learn just by looking at a Chinese directory how many characters there are in there, and then certainly not find the correlation of usage from one character to the next for all the pages of the dictionary. So
okay. Since the time is running out, I want to give Bennett a chance to answer. Steve has another word to say, and then we're going to have to put an end to it. So,
thank you.
Go ahead, Ben.
Oh, well, yeah, I mean, I think that's an apt characterization of what's in Stephen's paper. And I thoroughly agree that this is this is a kind of a demonstration of what happens in a Chinese dictionary go-round scenario or a Chinese room scenario. It could have been that the outcome was that actually it works just fine, at least in terms of behavioral metrics. You can have a Chinese dictionary go round, and it's indistinguishable from its behavior is indistinguishable from a human, which is a kind of evidence. So one kind of evidence is from the thought experiments. Another kind of evidence is the behavioral evidence, and now we're in a sticky situation. As it turns out, proponents of this thought experiment don't need to worry quite yet, because the models aren't actually explaining away human behavior. So for now, the behavioral evidence agrees with the thought experiments.
Okay, last question, and then I'll just do it one summary sentence. Go ahead, Steve. Oh, and Ben can answer. Steve, go ahead.
Yeah. No, it's just more of a reaction to what forget the first gentleman's name who came on after me and was talking about hidden markup models. I mean, this is, the parsnip model we did, which was a very large autoencoder for the time, did a lot of completion. Judy Cagle, who was a Chomsky trained linguist, she and I had done lots of work on trying to figure out what it knew and what it didn't know. And then I analyzed the internal structure, but this had like 287 nodes. When you have a billion, I'm sorry. Even the hidden markup models that might make sense, which is all it's doing really in terms of the actual, Ben, I disagree, it's not autoregressive, but it has some latent structure that it's filling out, and there's something like 160,000 tension weights that are being adjusted, and no one's analyzed that directly. So the technical aspect of this is still somewhere in the garage floor. No one knows what it's doing. No one knows how it works, and it shouldn't be doing what it shouldn't be talking to undergraduates about their work. I'm sorry, or summarizing movies or the countless of other billions of things that's doing out there right now because people are using it daily. So I just want to put this in the front of this thing just to say we don't know what's going on. Sorry.
Very good. Ben, your last word now to that.
Can I give? Sure. I think we were all surprised about 5 years ago when these transformers started doing the remarkable things that they started doing. I think that's why there's been so much attention on things that we care about and have cared about for our entire careers that now the rest of the world seems to care more about. And I think that that opens up lots of opportunities for research to happen that governments care about, that our friends and neighbors care about, that our undergraduates care about. So the positive spin on it is that it's a boon to the field, not just for the reasons that I've said here, that I think that we can learn stuff about human cognition from them, but also because this is our moment.
Okay, terrific. Very good interaction. Good harbinger of what's going to come. I've picked up on one thing that's definitely going to come. People will divide in terms of those who claim to be unsurprised by what LLMs can do and those who say they are surprised. I would say that the ones who say they're unsurprised haven't noticed something. And with that, thank you to all of you.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Stephen.